This is our 13th lesson on the introduction to the Bible, and we'll be having, of course, 2 lessons each night on Thursday nights until we finish the material. We're looking at biblical languages. The Bible was written in 3 basic languages. There are other words or word nouns such as names of people, names of places that are actually other languages, but by and large, the vast majority of the Bible is in these 3 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Bobby, can you mute your mic?
Do what?
Can you mute your mic?
No.
Just say, I didn't mute my other mic. The Bible was written in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And as I said a moment ago, with a few words, usually names of places and people that are in other languages. There's some peculiar characteristics for the 3 languages in which the Bible was written: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And we'll look at some of those characteristics. These will be important when we get to interpreting the Bible, that we remember these characteristics that these languages have. We'll be looking also in 2 lessons from tonight, week from tonight, at various writing materials upon which the Bible was written. Then we'll look in follow-up lessons at kinds of books. There are scrolls and codices. And so we'll be looking at the various kinds of books and kinds of writing materials. Now, most of the Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language. There are some portions that are written in Aramaic, and a few words, as I said, names of people and places that are in other languages. The parts of the Old Testament and New Testament were written in Aramaic, some parts of them, and most of the New Testament was written in Greek, again with a few words that are other languages, such as names of places and people, mostly. There are some isolated words, mostly names of people and places in other languages, in both the Old and New Testament, as I said. The Hebrew and Aramaic languages are Semitic languages, and that means they're languages from the descendants of Shem. And that's the people that speak these languages are by and large descendants of Shem. The verb is restricted in Hebrew and Aramaic as well, is restricted to 2 tense forms. I've not studied any Aramaic, but I understand it functions pretty much like the Hebrew. The verb is restricted to, in Hebrew, is restricted to 2 tense forms with a peculiarly regulated use. We'll give a little bit of this information about it, but we won't get into it in any great detail. The verb has 2 tense forms, perfect and imperfect, besides an imperative, but only in the active voice. 2 infinitives and a participle. And the Hebrew verbs have gender. So they do have gender. There's only 2 genders in the Hebrew language. That's masculine and feminine. There's no neuter gender. Grammatical structure of the Semitic family language exhibits numerous peculiarities. The noun only has 2 genders, masculine and feminine. So we do not have a neuter gender. The writing of Semitics has one striking fundamental defect. there's a defect in it compared to, say, English and some other languages. And only the consonants, which indeed form the substance of the language, are written in real letters. Only the consonants. The vowels are not written, see, while the vowels only no longer are indicated by certain representative consonants. It was only later that special marks, points, or strokes below and above the consonants were invented to represent to the eye all the vowel sounds. Somatic writing, moreover, invariably proceeds from right to left. So that in English, we write from left to right, but they write from right to left. So the reading goes from right to left. What would be the last page in an English book would be the first page in a Hebrew book. So they would go from what we call the back of the book to the front. And so that reads just backwards. First, in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1:1 is on what is the right-hand page, far right-hand page, which would be the last page in an English book. There's several Semitic languages. There's Arabic, Sabian, also Himyaritic, and Ethiopic. And so these three languages are Semitic languages. There's the Middle Semitic, and that's Canaanitish, Hebrew, Phoenician, and the language of the Moabites. Now remember, the Moabites were descendants of Lot. They were descendants of Lot. The Ammonites were also descendants of Lot. So we have those languages. Those are your languages that we have that are the Middle Semitic. The North Semitic are the Eastern Aramaic, Syriac, and Nassaureans, Sabaeans, and Samaritan, and Nabatean. And so the Samaritan also, Samaritan language. They were settled, northern tribes were settled by people from other parts of the empire, the Assyrian Empire. Okay. Eastern Semitic was the Syro-Babylonian cuneiform writings. So there's your south, middle, north, and eastern Semitic languages. Okay. There's no Western Semitic language unless it's through the colonization of the Phoenicians. Okay. Hebrew, let's go look at Hebrew now, has 22 letters in the alphabet. And they divided their scrolls up into 22 scrolls for the purpose of when they read. And so they would have to put, since they had what we number as 39 books, they had to put those on the 22 scrolls. So they were put on 22 scrolls. And so they would use that for finding, like cataloging the various things that were on those scrolls. Jeremiah and Lamentations were on one scroll, for example. The minor prophets were on another scroll. This makes the language, however, more compact if you don't write the vowels. And so more can be written in less space than the language which has to write the vowels. So that's one advantage of it. The disadvantage, there's a disadvantage to it also. There was a vowel pointing system, it's called. It was introduced in roughly 600 AD, probably around 650 AD. This system was first introduced about 650, between 600 and 700 AD. It was introduced by the Masoretes to preserve the pronunciation of the words. What happened was that Hebrew was no longer being widely spoken by the Jewish people. They had adopted the language of the land where they were living. They were rapidly losing the ability to pronounce the words. So the Masoretes figured out a way, a vowel pointing system to put the vowels in the words. So they put a pointing system on it. It's called the vowel pointing system. It was introduced long after the Old Testament was written, and they're not therefore inspired of God. The vowel points were put there by men about 650 AD. And the last part of the Old Testament was written roughly 400 BC, about 450 BC. So we're looking at over 1,000 years later before they put these vowel points in, after the last book was written. So we got about from 400, 450 BC to about 650. That's roughly 1,000 years. It's possible that the vowel points that were inserted by the Masoretes are incorrect, that some of them are. Probably most of them are correct, but there's some words that could be misinterpreted, and some alleged contradictions in the Bible may be a result of incorrect vowel pointing. We're going to show one here just in a minute. Hebrew word 1,000, Aleph, and that's Strong's number 505, is the same as the Hebrew word for a clan or a family, Aleph. And so again, you read from right to left, and so you'd have those same three consonants. If you look at them, and I'll put my mouse over it, this up here is exactly the same as this. And you read from right to left, Aleph, Lameth, Lamed, Pei. And they're all three the same letters. But when you put different vowel points, vowels with them, it'll make a different word. Aleph, which is 1,000, the number 1,000, and clan, which is a family, except for the vowels. Now, the Hebrews also had a way of making their numbers out of words, like the old. When I was in school, we learned the Roman numerals, and so they use actually letters to represent words. L and X and V and I and M and D and C. And those are most of your letters that were used. They had a system very similar to it. It's possible that some of the passages with very large numbers of soldiers may be referring to clans rather than thousands of soldiers. So 100,000 soldiers might really be 100 clans. The Handbook of the Bible by Edmonds, and it has more information in the file notes that I sent you. That's in the bibliography at the end of the notes. If it's not there, let me know and I'll send it to you. They also, the Masoretes were not directed by God in their introduction of vowel points. So there's a possibility that they might be mistaken. It required interpretation of the text in some instances to determine what vowels are put for each word. We've already seen this. Those two words, we go back to them. These two words here that have the same consonants, they just have different vowels. And of course, it's a matter of were the Masoretes right? Was it thousands or was it clans or families? It's possible that there were errors in it. And so we have also another situation. Early Hebrew was written in the Phoenician script. It wasn't written with the same letters. They had the same letters, but they weren't written the same way as the scripts that we have in our Bible, in our Hebrew Bibles. Later Hebrew was written in the Aramaic script. We'll be looking at these two scripts, and they found documents in the Phoenician script which date them very early. The Hebrew language has never had upper and lowercase letters. Yates, page 4, tells us this. Therefore, any distinction that's made in the Old Testament, my understanding is the Aramaic doesn't have them either. Therefore, any distinction that's made between upper and lowercase letters is not based upon the Hebrew text. Same thing applies to the Greek text. Originally, it was all uppercase or called uncial, but we'll get to that later. We'll note passages where words are treated differently, and we'll see this in the American Standard and in the King James. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Notice the word Spirit is lowercase in the American Standard, 1901 American Standard Version. But the King James Version writes, and Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And the word Spirit's uppercase. Now, so that shows that it's a matter of interpretation. Is it a disposition of God, or is it the Spirit of God, God's Spirit, or sometimes that's interpreted to mean the Holy Spirit? So again, that's a matter of interpretation here. Right? Here is the Phoenician script. Here's how the letters were written. And remember, the Phoenicians were a Semitic language. So they had their script. This is their script. And so this would be your first letter up here. My mouse is Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Hey, Wah, and so forth. That would be your letters. And we have 22 letters if you count them, all the way to the end of the alphabet. So these are the letters in the Phoenician script. Now, the interesting thing is a side point. They have recently found a big stone slab that has writing in the Phoenician script on it that goes way back to about 700 BC. And it's right out, almost word for word, out of the text of the Bible that we have. It's from either Chronicles or Kings. I've got it in my notes somewhere else, but we won't go through it here. This is a recent discovery in the last 5 or 6, 7 years. And it's a major find because it dates that material that's in the Chronicles, or I think it's in Kings, but it might be Chronicles. But it's several verses right out of it. It's right there, right near the temple. And so what they found is it's not in the Aramaic script, it's in the Phoenician script. That proves that this was written before the Hebrew, but before the Old Testament was changed over to the other script that we have now. This is the old script. Incidentally, the Samaritan Pentateuch is in this script. And they got their Pentateuch about 500 BC, approximately, somewhere thereabouts. After they went into Babylonian captivity, it might have been as early back as 600 BC. But 722 BC, they went into captivity. Somewhere thereabouts, a little bit after that, it appears they got the Pentateuch. And so they have their Pentateuch, it's written in this script. Right? And that's significant. It's very helpful to us in arguing for the text of the Old Testament. Right? But it's just the Pentateuch, the first 5 books that they have. Phoenician alphabet, there's your alphabet, and that's some of the things they represent. This is approximately 1400 BC. About 1450 BC, the children of Israel come out of Egypt. Approximately 1450 is where I date it. That's what is the script. Here's the alphabet in the Hebrew alphabet today. This is the Aramaic script. Now, where did they get the Aramaic script? Well, when the children of Israel, and this would be Judah and Benjamin, and remnants of all the other tribes, which if you'll study it, you'll see that there were remnants of the other tribes with them, that they went into Babylonian captivity. And when they did, they took their scriptures with them, and they changed their script to read like the Babylonians, their main text, which is the Aramaic script. Now, let me point out, They spoke a different language, but their language of commerce was Aramaic. Now, I'm going to go back in the United States as an illustration. The language of commerce, when our country was formed around 1776, was Latin. All of the major states in Europe, and then this included the United States, when they had representatives who would go from one place to another to represent their nation, these people, these ambassadors, would speak to one another in the Latin language. That was the language of everybody. Everybody knew Latin. Scientific documents were written in Latin and so forth. So the people learned Latin and they spoke it. So, and then later, the language of French became the language for commerce, for people to converse with each other. And so they spoke in French. Now they speak in English, but the French haven't given up, so they still speak in English and French both. And you'll see that at some of the big deals that they'll have, big conferences. And so right here, this is the language of the Aramaic script. So they began to write just like the Aramaic script. They didn't have to learn new alphabets. And so I want you to see something about this. There are 22 letters if you count them. But I want you to look here. This second letter looks a whole lot like this letter down here, a Kaf, right here. It looks a whole lot like it. You got to look at them closely to see that they're not the same. This 1, 2, 3, fourth letter, fifth letter, hey, my mouse, I lost it right there, looks a lot like this one right here, heth. And so, see, there's a little gap right there. There's not a gap right here. That's the difference. They sure look a lot alike, and it's easy. When I studied Hebrew, I sure had to be careful that I didn't confuse them. Also, this letter right here, let me get my mouse to come back. It can look a lot like this letter right up here. And they look a whole lot like this one's squared and this one's kind of rounded. That becomes a little bit of a problem for us. The resh looks a whole lot, it's kind of goes curly a little bit on top. Looks a lot like the Daleth up here. You look at them, you could easily confuse them for one another. And this is Ta, this last letter looks a little bit like this one up here. Could be confused, okay? So that creates a little bit of a problem. We have another situation here that's kind of unique, and we'll see probably why they do this, is there are 5 letters that have 2 forms. Right here, Kaf, and it has 2 forms. And this last form is when it's at the end of the word. And you say, well, why would that be? Well, we'll show why they would do that. This is the end of the word for mem and nun. See, they're written differently in peh and sadi. And so they all have, these 5 letters have a different form when they're the end of the word. When they're in the word somewhere, they're the same form. But at the end of the word, they change. So you could have a word that began with a Kaf and had some other letters between it, and then another Kaf at the end, and this would be at the beginning, this would be at the end of the word. They have the same letter. Okay? Right? So it gives kind of a KH sound whenever it's like this, okay? Both of these do, or a K. So both of them have the same sound. So keep that in mind. They don't sound different. They're the same letter. So that's kind of important, and that's one way that we know some things. So we'll see some other problems with it. We should note that 5 of the letters have different forms, and when the letters was in the word and one was at the end of the word. Okay. Greek has one letter that has a different ending form at the end of the word, and here's your sigma down here when it's in the word, and it looks like an S, a little bit like our S. This is the S sound in Greek. And our probably English S probably came from this form right here. This is when it's at the end of the word right here, this form right here. That's the Greek letter sigma, and it's equivalent to our S. This is useful because there's no spaces between words in the early manuscripts. I'm going to show you how they were, and like this right here. Let's take Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice in our English text, we have a space between each word. And so we can go and see our words clearly. And that's how they're written in English. Now, if we took the spaces out, it would read like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It would be hard for us to read in English because we're not used to reading like that. But I want you to notice something here. This right here takes up a different amount of space. This bottom one does. And so what we get is, this is bottom one, where you take the spaces out or it's more compact. The last line is, of course, shorter. And the top line is shorter, it just doesn't go to the end of the page. So what they would do is, because writing material, this is my theory, I don't know why they did this, but I suspect they wrote it this way because writing material was so precious and so expensive. And that's how they wrote it, because it was so expensive. And that's my theory. I'm not certain that's true, but it makes sense that that's probably the reason. But anyhow, that's how they wrote. And of course, if you write like this, you could easily get some words, and you could have in the beginning, and God created. And sometimes the heaven sand. See, if you broke it right here with the F between the S and the N in heavens, heaven, that could be heaven sand, the earth, okay? And so you could have a different word. And of course, we know what it reads up here because we got spaces. So that could be kind of confusing. So the fact that they had different endings for 5 of the Hebrew words, that would tell them that the word ended at that point. Okay. Same thing happens in our Greek language with the sigma. A lot of Greek words end with the sigma. Okay. It seems difficult to read. Those who learn to read with words probably look. Well, that's to me was sigma. I think it was harder to do. I tried to do it a page or two, and it was hard to read. Probably, if I got used to it, it probably would be okay. Back to our Hebrew alphabet, again, we have 5 of these letters that have different endings, and that'll tell where a word ends. That probably will eliminate some possible. The Jews adopted the Aramaic script after they went into Babylonian captivity. So they adopted it, some claim about 400 BC, approximately that time frame is when they adopted the Aramaic script. I don't know exactly. It's the Aramaic script is essentially the script that they use today. Now, if you take a Hebrew Bible, there'll be spaces between the words. And in the Hebrew Bible that I've seen, there's spaces between the words. And whereas they don't put them all together like they they did in the original manuscripts. If you had a manuscript, there would be no spaces between them. Aramaic languages came from Aram, the son of Shem, 22 through 23. The sons of Shem, Elam and Asher, and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. These are his sons. And the sons of Aram, Uz, and Hul, and Gether, and Mash. So the Aramaic language, best we can tell, come from Aram, the sons of Shem. Of course, this happened whenever we got the Tower of Babel and God confounded the languages to scatter the people. The Syrians spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of the diplomats in the time of Daniel. So it was a diplomatic language. People throughout the empire could read it. It continued even into the Medo-Persian Empire. Several parts of the Old Testament were written in Aramaic, and if you're looking at them and you don't know the difference, you think it's the same writing because they have the same alphabet. Daniel 2, verses 4 through 7:28 is in Aramaic. The rest of Daniel is in Hebrew. So when I go through Daniel, I explain why. I think it's because a lot of the text of Daniel 2, 4 through 7:28 was being used to educate the people in the empire that weren't Jews regarding God's prophecies to make them believe in the true God. And most likely that's my theory. In Ezra 4, verse 8 through 6:18 is written in Aramaic. And Ezra 7, verses 12 through 26 is in Aramaic. Again, if you're just looking at the text, and you don't know the difference between the languages because they have the same alphabet, you wouldn't see any difference probably.
Marion?
Yes.
I agree with you about the possibility of Daniel. Do you think the same purpose for Ezra? You know, why it was written in Aramaic regards to that, or?
Well, probably. Again, it was to communicate with the people around about them. Possibly they wanted it in that form. So if they were falsely accused, they would have documents say, here's the documents we've been handed to our people. And that could be a reason for it too. Because they were being falsely accused of fomenting, and building their temple in the walls of the city, going against the Medo-Persian kings or emperors. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
If I remember correctly, this kind of Aramaic is called Imperial Aramaic, so it would have been written, before, as, liberals like to date Daniel to the 2nd century. But, I mean, this shows that it would have been written much earlier, Ezra and Book of Daniel.
Because the Imperial Aramaic had died out by that time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a good point. And of course, all we need to do is supply with documentation that they have to have these Daniel written late because it has so many prophecies in it. And they can't stand it because their prophecies are true prophecies, and they prove that this is not written by man alone. It had to be by a superhuman being, supernatural being, and that would be only be God. So that's their problem. That's why they have to argue against it. Any other questions or comments there? There are 2 Aramaic words in Genesis 31:47. There are Aramaic words that have been transliterated into the Greek in the New Testament, such as Abba and Cephas and so forth. All right. Here's a chart. I found this on the internet, and it follows through with the languages. And about 1800 BC, the Proto-Canaanite language and the Phoenician language, if you'll notice here, I'll get my mouse to move around. And it's split off, and we have a Greek, and Archaic Greek, and then Greek. We'll follow that in the Cyrillic languages. Now, Russian and some of the other languages like Ukrainian or Cyrillic languages, they come out of the Greek. They're Cyrillic languages. They are actually a Hellenic language, which Helena is Greek, the word for Greek. So they're structured like the Greek language. Here are other languages that came out of it, Old Hebrew, Samaritan, and so forth. So these all came out of this Semitic base. We're not going to be looking at these, but people that really get into ancient languages have studied a lot of these languages. Here's Arabic, and then there's Persian. Farsi is the language that they call it, I believe. Now, let's look at Mark 15:34. In the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Now that's Aramaic. It's transliterated into Greek, but it's Aramaic, which is being interpreted because since it's a foreign language, he's going to interpret it. And he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And this, of course, is a quotation from the Old Testament. And so we have another word. Now, at the end of this file, I'll have a link to a sermon that I preached in our lectureship in 2023 last year on this very expression, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And so I'll have a link on that file. In Mark 5:41, and taking the child by the hand, he saith unto her, Talitha cumi, and which is being interpreted because it's Aramaic, damsel, I say unto thee, arise. So he's telling her to arise up. So again, it's transliterated into Greek in this case, and of course we read it in English. Okay, so it's interpreted for us. Now, here is an internet link for Aramaic words in the New Testament. And so in the Greek New Testament, it has a list of all those words, and I won't bother you with it. But of course, you can pause this on YouTube and write this link down and go to it on, it's Wikipedia, which Wikipedia has gotten much better. It's probably pretty good, but it's pretty accurate. There are a number of Aramaic words in the New Testament. This lists them, and they're transliterated into Greek letters in our Greek New Testament. The scripture written in 3 main languages. This would be, of course, Hebrew, most of the Old Testament. Main parts of the Old Testament and certain words or phrases in the New Testament. And Greek. We'll see what kind of Greek this is later in the next lesson. Most of the New Testament, with a few words, and phrases in the New Testament. Right? Several unique characteristics of Hebrew that affect our interpretation of the Old Testament. So we need to be aware of that. And so what we have here is the Hebrew language. Again, didn't have any distinction between upper and lower case, and of course it didn't write the vowels. That could be another problem. Aramaic has some of the same characteristics of books that I read claim that it does. I haven't studied any Aramaic. Greystone marks at 1534 and the parallel passages to it. And here's the link to that. That's our 2023 lectureship here in Oklahoma City that I spoke on. And so, again, all you got to do is pause this on YouTube and you can write this down. Are there any questions?
Nope.